Hello and welcome to the first video for week 3 of Exploring English Education, English and Identity from School to Cinema. This first video is going to introduce you first to a particular model of being able to talk a little bit more systematically and descriptively and rigorously about this idea of identity, which can be quite a woolly concept. And then is going to introduce you to some of the key issues surrounding teaching English, but also being an English student, building on several of the ideas that we've talked about so far in this module. So in week 1, we talked, if you recall, about different conceptions of what English is or should be for, and we talked about different models that have been proposed over the years of different ways of talking about these different ideas. And last week we talked about English at university, and we thought in particular about your experiences as students, and we talked about some of the differences in transitioning from English at school to English at university. And in particular throughout both of these weeks we've talked about these competing aspects of English, different topics, different areas that all fall under this umbrella of English and what it is, that different people taking this module will have encountered different parts of in the course of their degree. In particular, we're going to draw on some of the tensions related to English as language and linguistics and English as literature. And I'm going to talk to you as we move through this week's first video about these different ideas. In the later part of the video, I'm going to introduce you to some research that I'm very excited about that I have been doing over the past couple of years, looking at English and identity, in particular in relation to reading and conceptions about English and what people have read, what teachers have read, what they think they should have read, and how that can bleed through both into the classroom and into the wider world about ideas that people have about what English is or should be for, and what they think English as a subject is in particular if it's not a subject that they study any longer themselves. So let's begin with this first model of talking about identity a little bit more systematically. Now, I think this is a really useful model. It's very simple. It has just 2 terms to it: self-conception and self-images. I would really recommend that you take a little bit of time watching this video to get your head around this concept, because it's a concept that lends itself extremely well to several other aspects of the module that we're going to cover as we move through. So this is not just something that I think is relevant to talk about when we're going to look at the second video about fictional representations of teachers and students and educational spaces, but it's also something that I think lends itself very well to talking about things like ability grouping, things like studying fiction, things like being a linguist or a language graduate and going into a school. Even things like technology and whether or not you conceive of that as part of your job when you come into teaching, and perhaps you find yourself in a situation like this one where suddenly you're being asked to do things in your profession that you perhaps have not done before or aren't particularly familiar with. We're going to think about ideas like identity threat and identity challenge, things that can happen to us that make us feel good and reinforce our sense of identity, and things that we like to have, and things that are potentially problematic or can knock people's confidence. We're going to think about that in relation to both teachers and students today. So, Day and colleagues, and this is the link to this is available in the reading list and the wider reading in relation to this research if you're interested in pursuing this area, offers a sort of summary of a lot of years of research about thinking about identity, and generally agrees that it's best to think about identity in terms of self, and rather than thinking about this our sense of self as something which is one stable, uniform thing that is unchanging, that it's actually a bit more complicated than that. So Day et al. Suggests that in particular a slightly more complex notion of an individual and the idea of multiple possible selves as opposed to one stable self is a more useful way to think about it. So a really good way to think about this is you're probably a slightly different version of yourself when you are at work compared to when you are at home, compared to when you're at university. These are all you, these are all parts of you yourself, but these different versions, Day suggests that in particular when we're talking about this academically, that it's really useful to think about these different aspects of our personality, these different faces that we put on, these different versions of ourselves as multiple possible selves. And they say that in relation to education, this is really useful because we are always talking about, whether we're talking about teachers or we're talking about students, people moving in and out of perhaps a more professional context, if you're a teacher, or an education space, if you're a student, outside into a more personal setting, and that sense of personal and professional identity, or the education version of yourself, the university version of yourself, and the version of yourself that you are at home are not necessarily quite the same thing. So that's one really useful starting point for us. Now, Turner, back in 1968, and you can often tell when models are really good and really useful if they're old, because it tends to mean that they've remained in use, that people have retained talking about these ideas and people haven't really felt they've improved on them for a long time. So I think that this is a really, really useful framework for us to use these two terms to start thinking a bit more systematically about these multiple possible selves and how they interact, and in particular, how they function when we're thinking about moving in and out of education spaces like a school or a university. So he distinguishes these two terms, self-image and self-conception. Self-image, he says, is the version of ourselves that is constantly being tested as we move through the day. So we have this idea of who we think we are, and as we interact with our environment from day to day, from minute to minute, from hour to hour, that constantly we're encountering self-images that either reinforce or potentially disrupt our more stable sense of self, which he calls self-conception. So he says self-conception is this more stable than a completely fixed sense of self that is more persistent or enduring. So for instance, in the context of education, this might be something like, I'm an English student, or I'm an English teacher. That is something that I feel is a relatively stable part of my identity. It might be personality traits that we feel like we have, like I think I'm quite nice, I think I'm quite calm, I think that I'm quite clever. And he says that we carry around this self-conception, and as we move through our day-to-day interactions, the self-images that we receive from our environment can either reinforce that self-conception or they can disrupt it. So a really good example of this, thinking back to when we were talking about English at university last week, and in particular we were talking about some of the challenges of transitioning to university that face many students, is we might think about somebody having a self-conception of being clever and good at English. And then they turn up in first year and they go to some modules, and one of two things might happen. So they might go to their lectures and they might think, yes, this is absolutely for me. These are the kinds of things I'm talking about. I understand this. I feel really comfortable with this. And that would be an example of somebody who has that self-conception that is then being reinforced by lots and lots of positive self-images that confirm to that person that that self-conception is accurate, that that is an accurate representation of themselves that they're carrying around. In the alternative, and this can happen very often, and I know that a lot of you offered some very interesting comments about this in relation to attendance policies, where many of you felt that a positive about attendance policies was sort of to almost try and guard against this, is that you might turn up and actually it feels very overwhelming. Perhaps you don't go to as many of your lectures or seminars as you would have hoped that you were going to. Perhaps you're getting to grips with a new city, you're meeting new friends, you're meeting new people, and so you're not necessarily receiving those self-images, and that can be quite anxiety-provoking. And then perhaps you turn up a couple of weeks into your course, and suddenly it feels really overwhelming, and everybody else you think seems to know what they're doing, and you don't feel that way. Or perhaps you get your first assignment back, and it's not a mark that's as strong as you would have hoped for. That could be an example where the self-images that you receive actually have the potential to disrupt and really threaten that self-conception. And in extreme cases, it can actually change it. So that might be cases where, for example, somebody stops coming to university to prevent themselves from encountering those negative self-images. So I would rather sit at home and think that I am clever and that I'm good at English, and I don't like going into my lectures because when I go in, I get all of these negative self-images that threatens this thing that I actually think is quite sensitive and quite core to my sense of being. So that's one way in which we could think about using these two terms, self-conception, our more stable sense of self, and self-images, the things that we receive from moment to moment, to talk about, in quite detailed terms, I think, an example of what can happen to a person's sense of self when they are interacting with education in an educational space. So you'll hopefully have seen from my explanation of this already, but just to clarify therefore, self-image and self-conception, Turner says, are these two distinct parts of ourself, but they are two intrinsically related terms. And I think Giovanelli, who some of you will have read as it's one of the options for the reading this week, offers a really concise and helpful summary of this. He says, self-images build into self-conception. So these moment-to-moment interactions that we have with our environment are the things that develop and shape our self-conception, our more stable sense of self. They build into self-conception in ways that alter it. In turn, self-conception may be seen to act as a testing base against which self-images are compared and evaluated, integrated or rejected through a process of editing. Self-conception is thus dynamic and interactive. Identity formation is always situated within a defined social context, motivated by external pressures and forces, and is always defined as a type of ongoing reinvention. And we're thinking specifically here about someone's identity, their self-conception, in relation to the self-images that they receive in educational settings, whether that's as a teacher or a student. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more detail about this now in relation to English specifically. So what do we know from the research? Well, we know that typically speaking, most people who are English teachers who are currently in the profession will tend to have a self-conception that is more oriented towards literature than it is language and linguistics. And that is very simply because the profession as it's currently made up has an overwhelming majority of teachers who have done a degree that is focused on literature rather than language and linguistics. So Goodwin, who worked very extensively in English teacher training, and is the other reading that you may have chosen for yourself to look at for this week, he did some really interesting research and identified that most trainees, when you ask them at interview why they want to be an English teacher, will self-identify as a lover of reading, and that this tends to be the first reason that people will cite as a key reason for entering the profession. And now if we think about the fact that most English teachers will tend to have a background in literature, that's probably not surprising, is it? Now, what's really interesting about this research, and I think an important thing to bear in mind, is Goodwin really queries whether or not this is always true, or whether it's what trainee English teachers think they're supposed to say. And this is something we're going to look at in a lot more detail as we move through this week. So is it the case, really, that English teachers are lovers of reading? Or is it the case that socially, somehow we have constructed a notion that English teachers should be lovers of reading, and therefore when you interview them and you ask them why they want to be an English teacher, that's what they say? And this is something I'm going to explore in a bit more detail. Now, one really interesting area and one particular challenge for English, in particular as a secondary school subject that we've encountered in recent years, is that this prevalence of associations between being an English teacher as being somebody who is a lover of literature and reading, and in particular the backgrounds that English teachers tend to have in literature, has meant that there have been real challenges about the huge influx in recent years of language and particularly grammatical terms, so being able to label parts of a sentence and so on, into the curriculum right the way through from primary all the way through to teaching A-level English language. This is largely because, first, of the historic training that teachers will have tended to have in literature, but also something which is called the grammar gap. The grammar gap is essentially the fact that for many, many years in secondary schools in this country, grammar was not explicitly taught. So it may well have been taught in relation to modern foreign languages, and you're doing your French or your Spanish or German and so on, but we didn't explicitly teach grammar. We didn't teach those terms that teachers are now expected to teach themselves to those teachers when they were students at school. And what you find is that that creates a huge amount of anxiety amongst many, many English teachers in the profession today, in particular oriented around teaching A-level English language, where they feel really, really uncomfortable. So there is a strong sense of identity threat. So think about that if you've got a self-conception as I'm a good English teacher and I love reading, and your self-conception therefore is largely tied up in your association of English as literature, and suddenly you're asked to teach A-level English language. What's likely to happen? Well, that's a very, very threatening, very anxiety-provoking scenario to be in. Now, this study, all of these quotations are taken from Giovanelli 2015, and this was a really interesting study where he followed, I think it was 8 teachers, fairly newly qualified teachers, who were being asked to teach A-level English language when they had backgrounds purely in literature. And he followed them over the course of 2 years to see what happened to them. What did they do? How did this affect their sense of identity? And the findings were really, really interesting. Now, just as an aside, you may think, well, why do these newly qualified teachers end up teaching A-level English language in the first place? This is largely because in schools, in many schools at least, people want to teach A-level. There are opportunities for career progression that people will have if they've taught English language or English literature A-level. And at the same time, many senior members of English departments will tend to have backgrounds in literature and therefore will want to teach the literature courses themselves. So for many newly qualified and early career teachers, the only real opportunities that are offered in the first years of the profession to teach A-level at all is it's English language or it's nothing. And for the language students in the room, you might want to think about how interesting that is in terms of positive or negative attitudes that teachers may hold towards A-level English language when very often they're placed in a context where they don't feel like it's their area of expertise when they begin to teach it, and that it's something which is potentially very anxiety provoking. And you can see that reflected in some of these quotations here. I'm not going to read them for you, I'll just pause for a moment and let you have a moment to read these through. So you can see that these are 4 different teachers, and feel free to pause the video if I've not given you quite enough time there. These are 4 different teachers out of the study, all narrating that they were subject to this grammar gap that I've just talked about, that suddenly they're being asked to teach English language and linguistics at quite a high level. And none of these teachers really have had very much training in it, either as students at school themselves or indeed on their teacher training courses. And this is really interesting to see what this results in, and you can see just looking at some of the adjectives that are being engaged here, or some of the noun phrases that people are using to describe themselves. I felt like a bit of a fraud. It was like teaching geography. Petrified, scared. I didn't want to have to do it. I regretted saying yes. I felt nervous. I felt panic. I felt abject terror. We've got Anna near the bottom as well, and Belinda mirroring that and saying it was terrifying. Now, I just want you to take a moment to think about whether or not you've ever really thought about your teachers having emotions like this in relation to the kind of things that they're teaching you, and how that might affect how they feel about the subject and how they feel about themselves and their sense of identity going into those classrooms where suddenly they're moving from an area where they're teaching texts, if we're talking about these teachers with background in literature, and feel very comfortable getting lots of positive reinforcement about, yes, this is why I came into the job, this is what I'm really good at, this is what I enjoy, and suddenly experiencing these kinds of emotions and being in a class of 30 students and suddenly being asked to handle it. So this is one really, really interesting area. Now, those of you who have read this study will already know this, but this story does have a happy ending in that what uniformly all of these teachers said at the end of this study was that once they had got to grips with studying language and linguistics, that they really, really loved it, that they felt that it changed their self-conception and their sense of identity as an English teacher in a really, really positive way, and that they wished that they'd had these experiences of being exposed to and trained in language and linguistics earlier. So when we think back to some of the conversations we were having last week about how we carve up English into different bits of different modules, different degree courses, is there something quite interesting here about suggesting that actually, even perhaps if you're doing a literature degree, if you're thinking about going into teaching, should it be a necessary component of your degree to do a bit of language and linguistics to avoid these emotions happening and people having to deal with them on their own? So I'm going to turn this on its head a little bit now and talk about this in relation to literature and reading, because it's certainly not the case that teachers who enter with a background in literature get away with avoiding any of these sorts of feelings of identity threat. This is just a summary of the people who participated in a study that I did last summer that was an anonymous survey of people talking about texts, was the name of this study. It was called Talking About Texts. And it asked people questions like, are you ever embarrassed about books that you haven't read? Would you ever lie and say that you'd read a book and you hadn't? Now, I'm also not going to be able to talk to you about this research in detail. It is detailed in a forthcoming chapter of a book I've got coming out next year. It's not out yet, but if anybody is interested in it, I would be very happy to share that chapter with you if you'd like to read more about the findings, so do feel free to just drop me an email. But the important thing that I want to show you here is that overwhelmingly, the participants tended to have some sort of background in education. So nearly half of them were teachers, and many of them were English teachers. A lot of them, over 100, were academics, so people like me who teach you in university, and nearly another 100 were people who worked in some sort of role within education. So I just want you to bear that in mind when I show you these next findings, because I think you might find some of them quite surprising. So this is the first, one of the questions I asked them. Do you ever feel embarrassed about books you haven't read? 45.8% of people said yes, and 54.2% of people said no. So not far off, half of the people who responded that said yes, they do feel embarrassed about books they haven't read. Now, that's predominantly people who work in education, people who teach you, will have taught you at school, perhaps even teach you now, who feel that way. And I might suggest that probably that yes answer would probably be higher in the general population, but that I think is something that's really important, because how often do we convey that to students? Do students, whether they're at school or university, do they have any awareness that this is how their teachers feel, that many of them feel embarrassed about books that they haven't read? Have you ever sat in a class and felt this way, and have you ever thought that perhaps your teacher might feel the same? What's really interesting about this is when you ask people to elaborate on why they feel this way, and I'm not going to go through these things in detail, but in particular, I want to talk about this bottom left bullet point, because it's the one that's really relevant to what we're talking about today, is that people who answered yes to this question, and bear in mind that a lot of the people who answered this survey are teachers or academics, one of the main reasons that they tended to cite for this was their expectations or assumptions about them, typically relating to their job, made them feel this way. And when you drill down into the data and look at what people actually said, you can see these patterns emerging very prevalently. So this is the one that I really want us to focus on. And when you go and look at the data, you look at what people have said. For the linguists in the room, this is a corpus concordance diagram. You don't really need to know what that is, but it is a bit of software that allows you to search very large amounts of text very quickly and identify patterns like these. And there were actually 38 instances of this specific phrase. So think about this in terms of invoking a particular professional identity. Was 38 instances of, as an English teacher, I feel like this. As an English teacher, there is an expectation. So many English teachers feel that there are assumptions that are made about their job, typically to do with them having read everything, that make them feel anxious, that make them feel embarrassed, that encourage them to lie about things that they have or haven't read. And I'll just show you a few more examples of this. I think there's a really prevalent pattern here. You can just see as we move about sort of halfway down this concordance diagram of, as an English teacher, I feel. And just look at the consistency there. I feel I should have, I'm expected, I should read, I should have done this. So a really tense relationship there between people who are working in the English profession and what they feel like they should have read, what they feel they should enjoy, what they feel that expectations are that are placed on them as a result of their professional role. Now, the last thing that I want to talk to you about is this. Because what is it that they feel that they should have read, and perhaps this will come as a surprise to you, as perhaps it won't, is that there's a very strong pattern that emerged from this research of people feeling like they should have read the classics, the canon, those sort of great works of literature. Think about the cultural heritage model of English that we were talking about the other day, things that are pushed very strongly in our current curriculum documents that make up a very large amount of the current diet of English literature and English in secondary school. And what we have here is evidence of many teachers feeling like they should have read more of them. Now, this I think is really interesting when we think about whether or not this feeling that they should have read more classics is ever conveyed to students. And I suspect that actually there are a lot of teachers out there who have lots and lots of students sitting in front of them who feel like they should have read the classics when actually their teachers are sat in the same classroom feeling exactly the same way. And isn't that interesting that those interactions mean that for whatever reason, those very sort of threatening aspects, those threatening feelings towards our identity, are not things that are typically shared between English students and English teachers. And here are just a few examples of this, and again, I'm not going to read them to you. I'll just take a moment to pause to let you have a look through them, and feel free to pause the video if you'd like to read them in detail, as what teachers actually say when they elaborate on this feeling. So just to conclude then, I want to suggest to you that many English teachers feel that they should have read more of the classics, and it's interesting to reflect on why this is, and what this means for us in the current moment for a curriculum that is increasingly oriented towards these kinds of texts. It's also very clear that English is still very evidently characterised, in particular by people who work as English teachers in the profession themselves, as English is literature as opposed to English is language, even though we know from the Giovanelli study that actually when teachers embrace language and linguistics as part of their identity as an English teacher, that the results are overwhelmingly positive for their sense of identity and confidence in their job. So does this mean, though, that there is a pressure to present as well-read, and I put that deliberately in inverted commas, as an enjoyer of certain works that's felt by many teachers? And what does that mean for teachers? I'm sure that there are some of you watching the video right now who are thinking about going into the teaching profession, who don't have a background in literature. Perhaps you're doing language, or perhaps you're doing creative writing. So what does this mean for those teachers who are entering and find themselves in a profession when their background wasn't in literature? From the point of view of students, I think it's really interesting for us to reflect on whether or not we're tacitly, so not saying it explicitly, but that sort of feeling is always there, that we're communicating to young people that being, inverted commas, good at English means being a prolific reader, means that you have to read everything, and that probably that involves reading and enjoying the classics as well. And finally, are we tacitly communicating that readers and English teachers have read and enjoyed all of the classics when in fact this just isn't true? So I hope you've enjoyed this video today. We're going to pick some more of these ideas up in video 2, and there are tasks that are related to this, and I shall look forward to discussing this with you in the live sessions. Thank you very much.